Now, we've already seen this phenomena. We saw this phenomena on the shift from one technology life cycle to another. And this is what it would look like with S-curves. Yeah? So when we looked at the technology life cycle, we were looking at sales of a technology over time. And then we saw how with one technology, it improved over time and then died. And then a new technology had new sales and then would die. This is not looking at sales, it's looking at technological performance. Okay? Let's imagine that this curve here is about the performance of computers based on semiconductors. Whether we know what those are, it doesn't really matter. It's based on this technology that is in here. At some point, and it's difficult to know exactly when, they will reach a limit. Okay? Already there are quite a few companies looking at alternatives, which will make this look obsolete and ridiculous in a few years' time. So there are companies that are looking at DNA strings. They can already do addition and subtraction subtraction with DNA strings. If you can do 0 and 1, digital 0 and 1, yes, no, with some kind of technology, then you can create a computer, because all a computer is behind this is lots of zeros and ones. Yeah? So already, at a very, very basic level, people are using quantum physics, people are using genetic engineered strings. They're using all sorts of technology that might make the power of the computer here look absolutely trivial. So what we'll see in the future, and I'm not sure when, because it's not the technology I know a great deal about, we will see a new technology emerge that will replace the computer. If it is, for example, in relation to DNA, then clearly that's a very different technology than semiconductors. So again, if you go back to your point, if companies like Intel don't start thinking about different types of technology, DNA, which they wouldn't even think of necessarily, they may die within a few years' time, which is, given the size of the company, is perhaps hard to believe. Unfortunately for companies, they actually find it quite difficult to move from one S-curve based on one technology onto a new technology. And the reason is, companies like Intel have made all of their money and all of their success on an existing technology. And it's once you've got into a mindset about, well, we've been very successful with this technology, it becomes very difficult for them to say this technology is no longer useful. And it happens, you can use the analogy with yourself. If you've been successful with a particular strategy, it's difficult sometimes to imagine that times have changed and your skills are no longer valuable. But sometimes that self-reflection, whether at an individual level or an organizational level, is important. Because just because something made you successful as an organization or an individual 15 years ago doesn't mean it'll be the same thing that makes you successful in the future. Companies find that very, very difficult to handle, particularly if they've been hugely successful. And it's often why very successful large organizations struggle, why they're not very agile, because all of their being is linked into an existing technology. People's professions, people's careers are linked into the past. Again, so companies become locked into the present and the past. And if you become locked into the present and the past, it's very difficult to set up the kind of strategies which involve moving forward. That's just an example with computers where you had vacuum tubes to transistors. One of the problems with the S-curve is we don't know where the limit is. Why do you think we don't know where the limit is? Or what do you think limits our knowledge of where the limit might be? Well, we are limited by what we know now. And what you find is if you look at the projections of the performance of the computer, that the top of that S-curve has been pushed up and up and up. And the reason is because what we think is possible now becomes actually, or what we think is impossible becomes possible, because we learn more about how to solve the problems we thought were unsolvable. And so what you find is actually it's very difficult to work out what the technological limit is, because it requires us to know everything about the technology. And this happens over time. So although it's quite an interesting model, it's quite difficult to apply in a very specific way. For me, it's useful only as a signal that we have to think about at what point do we start looking at the future. I'm not going to get you to go through these. At the end of each model, I've got a summary of the key features of the model, the limitations of the model, so you can take away and read that. I'm not going to go through the details now, but we've been talking about some of the limitations and some of the features. Okay, so far we've talked about two different patterns that happen over time with an innovation. One is, just like the product life cycle, as a technology matures, its sales go up, they mature, and eventually go down. The second model, we've shown that over time, performance increases very slowly, increases rapidly, and then tails off. So that's the second thing that we can see over time. The third thing that we see over time is something called, it's linked to something called the product process cycle. And what this means is that very early on in a new technology, all the emphasis is on developing products. Yep. So if you look at the PCs, again, very early stage of the PC market, you had Amstrad, you had Sinclair, you had Acorn, you had Apple, all of these different varieties of product. But what you see happening over time is there's a shift away from variety of product. And companies start thinking about how can we produce this product cheaper with higher quality. So what you see in the very early stages of a new sector is the focus is on product and innovation in the product. As a product matures, you see a shift from product to process. So if you look at the computer now, most of the innovation that's happening in computers is actually how can you manufacture it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper with higher quality than it had before. So what we've seen in the computer sector, for home computers in particular, is we've seen lots and lots of variety and lots and lots of focus on product design. And now I guess the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen a much greater focus on how can we produce computers for cheaper and higher quality, or at least consistent quality. And of course, lower cost and consistent quality are about innovation in the way that we manufacture computers. They're not about product innovation, they're about process innovation. And this happens in lots of different sectors when we're developing products. That the focus shifts at some point from product variety and product innovation to process. This is one of the models that works incredibly poorly in the service sector. And what you actually have in the service sector is the opposite, okay? And it's actually called the reverse product process cycle. Because the only way, well, not the only way, the dominant way that service companies, such as financial services, retail services, one of the dominant ways these days in which companies can develop new products is on the back of process. So for example, if you're a bank, many of the products that you deliver are probably based on technology. So for example, online banking, telephone banking. A lot of the financial products that we use today have only been made possible by technological process innovation. Okay, so what we see in the service sector is innovation has had to happen in process before product. And once the technology has emerged in relation to the internet, in relation to ATMs, cash machines, all those sorts of things, it has then allowed a proliferation of product innovation or service innovation. So the service sector, you would see the reverse of this happening. Does that make sense? Now again, you can imagine here, this has major implications for strategy. Yeah, that if companies, I mean, some companies are very, very good at product innovation. Other companies are very good at process innovation. Now, if you look at the computer industry, the companies that develop, so the companies that sell computers today and manufacture computers today are not the companies that produced the variety of products in the past. So you've got a lot of companies that are basically good at manufacturing innovation. They're good at low-cost, high-quality products, but they're very often very poor at product innovation. So we've actually see, as a sector matures, you see a shift from companies that focus on product innovation, eventually to a different set of companies that are focusing on producing those products where the design is now stabilized, produce them cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And the innovative companies that produce the innovative products have moved on to something else. So there's this constant flux of companies that are good at product innovation, they innovate, the design stabilizes, they move on, a different set of companies come in with a different set of skills that basically innovate in process and focus on cost reduction. And this kind of links into the work that you've probably seen on Porter. Have you seen the work on Porter? Leadership, followership? Not in the way that Alan was talking about, by the way. A leadership strategy is where a company is essentially first to market. Yeah. So if a company's first to market, it has to have a very particular set of skills. Yeah. So a good example would be Sony. Another old example showing my age. The very first Sony Walkman, 1979, I believe. Prior to the Sony Walkman, which was about this size, I don't know if you remember this, people used to walk around streets, particularly Coventry in England, with huge, what do you call them, blasters, blasters. And if you ever see pictures of the 1970s, you'll see people walking with these. And it's partly culture, but it was partly that's the technology that existed. Anyway, Sony came up with a revolutionary consumer product, which was the Sony Walkman. And the Sony Walkman was a completely different type of product. It actually used a lot of existing technology at the time, but nevertheless it was an interesting product. But they required very different skills, because what they had to do was to create what you call primary demand. There was no existing marketplace for this kind of product. So they had to have skills in creating primary demand, i.e. opening up the market. They had to have very good skills in distribution to make sure that they could get this product out quickly. But they were able to charge what you call premium profits. They were able to get premium profits because they were the only people in the market. They had innovative products. They could charge a high price, just like Apple does with the iPhone. Although that market's starting to become quite competitive, actually. They could charge premium profits. So what you saw in that, for Sony, they ended up dominating the market. In fact, they dominated the market until the Apple iPod, I think, in terms of design, in terms of a sales volume. One slide aside, when Sony tried to first sell this product. So the third kind of model I'm looking at is that over time what you see in innovation is a shift from a focus on product innovation to a focus on process innovation.